The second part about triangles you've learned before, and so this is going to be a quick review. This is the Pythagorean Theorem, or however you want to say that word. That's my favorite way, so that's what I'm going to go with. The Pythagorean Theorem states that for any right triangle, c squared equals a squared plus b squared. Okay, but what that really means is that if you square the hypotenuse, that's this guy over here, if you square the hypotenuse, you get the other two sides squared put together. Okay, so you need to make sure that when you're using the Pythagorean theorem that your c side, the way that you set this up, this is always the hypotenuse. Okay, that's very important. The hypotenuse, you can tell it's the hypotenuse because it's always the longest side, but also you can tell it's the hypotenuse because it is on the opposite side of the triangle from the right angled triangle. And that's actually the better way of telling. Okay, because sometimes some of the sides, they look pretty close to the same size, and so it's not always easy to tell that way, but you can always tell where the right angle is because there's a little square in the corner. Okay, so we're going to do a few examples here. First, we're going to calculate the length of the missing side A. That's the hypotenuse. And so we can just use c squared equals a squared plus b squared. Or some people like to write it a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That's the same thing. So now we want to put in the numbers for a and b. It doesn't really matter which one you call a and b. Okay, so here's the important thing. This side is called side A, but that does not mean that it is this side here. Okay? You need to forget about whatever those sides are called, on whatever they're labeled on the triangle, and relabel them. Okay, so this guy over here, this is actually going to be our side C. It's what goes in the hypotenuse spot. Okay, and the other two, doesn't really matter which one is which. So this one can be A, this one can be B, or the other way around. They're just added together anyway. And so c squared equals 9.4 squared plus 7.6 squared. Okay, so we're going to add those, we're going to square those things and add them up. But before we do that, I want to point out that in order to figure out what the hypotenuse is, we're going to end up needing to get rid of this squared thing on the hypotenuse. The opposite of squaring, or the reverse of squaring, is square rooting, or figuring out the square root. So in the end, what we're going to do is c equals the square root of 9.4 squared plus 7.6 squared. Okay, that's what we're going to do in the end. Now, I don't mind if you put into your calculator 9.4 squared plus 7.6 squared equals, and then press square root. That's fine. But you will get a more accurate answer if you're not retyping the numbers in over and over again and rounding them each time. Okay, so typing it in just like this, the square root of 9.4 squared plus 7.6 squared, that's going to get you the best answer. Okay, so that's figuring out the hypotenuse. Let's figure out a side that is not the hypotenuse. So this A over here, we can tell that that's not the hypotenuse because it is not across from that 90-degree angle. The hypotenuse is this 125. And so when we use c squared equals a squared plus b squared, we're not going to put 125 and 98 in these two spots. Okay, because we said that the hypotenuse always has to go in the C spot. Okay, so we're going to put the 125 in for C, because it's the hypotenuse and always has to go there. And then this 98, this has to go in either the A spot or the B spot. It doesn't really matter. But because the other one is labeled A, let's leave it A, and let's put the 98 in the B spot. Okay, so that's the equation that we have right there. But the A that we're looking for is right in the middle of the equation, and that won't do. We've got to rearrange that thing. So algebra is what we need to do. We need to use our algebra skills to rearrange this. And so what I see on this side is that there is a 98 squared that has been added to that a squared. The a squared and the 98 squared are attached to each other with addition. And so in order to remove that 98 squared from that side, I'm going to subtract 98 squared. Okay, it's the opposite of addition. It's added to the a squared, and so I'm going to subtract it. And what I do to one side, I have to do to the other side, or else they're not equal anymore. And so what I end up with is a squared is equal to 125 squared minus 98 squared. Okay, now in order to figure out a, I'm going to have to get rid of this squared as well, right? So I'll still have to do that square rooting thing I did on the previous one. So a is going to be equal to the square root of 125 squared minus 98 squared. That's equal to a. And when I plug that into my calculator, I get 77.6. And that's in millimeters. You should always put the units on it. Now let's just take note here of what this equation is, because some people don't want to do this rearrangement step all the time. They don't want to do the algebra step every time. And if you remember what the rearrangement was, it is faster to not do that rearrangement over and over again. Okay, so it's a good idea to understand what you're supposed to do. Algebra is a good skill to have in math, but if you want to just get to the end, which I'm sure you do, notice what we did. This was c squared, this was a squared, which it still is, and this was b squared. And what we ended up doing was subtracting b squared. So let's re-look at this equation down here. This is now c squared minus b squared equals a squared. Okay, and so you can remember that if you're looking for a side that's not the hypotenuse, c squared minus b squared equals a squared. That's the rearrangement of it. Or if you prefer to do it in a different order for some reason, c squared minus a squared equals b squared. That's just as good.